All right, everybody. We have Randolph Schiffer here today. I'm going to let you introduce yourself, Randolph, but I'm really excited to have you on for an episode. So tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive into the stories you share that help us overcome fear and anxiety.
Well, here in the third stage of my life, I have come to write a children's book about fear and anxiety in children and bedtime stories that might help them manage it and process it. It was a long road to get here. I really had three careers. I started off in the 1960s. I was a Marine infantry officer in Vietnam. When I came back, I became a doctor. I did that for 35 years. I did psychiatry, neurology, internal medicine. I always did pediatrics too.
I love that.
And then about age 62, I just couldn't take it anymore.
Mm,
Dealing with the terrible diseases, the emergency room, the intensive
yeah.
care units, the children. So I had to quit because I developed pathological weeping. You'll probably
Mm,
see that before this interview is over.
okay. Wow, that's we have a lot of overlap. My specialty was in pediatrics, and I left for a similar reason, but much earlier in my career. It's very hard to it's hard to explain to people what the world of pediatrics is like. In terms of, I love working with families, I love working with children, but it does do something to you when you're seeing all of these horrible things happen to people on a daily basis. What would you share with us? What was the backdrop that led you to writing the children's book? Because it sounds like it was a personal story and a personal experience for you.
Yes, my wife and I, have two sons, and 35 years ago, the older one was diagnosed with ALL, acute lymphocytic leukemia. He was 3 years old.
Wow.
I was in peds. I knew about this disease, and at that time, 50% of them died. But I also knew, I had this impression very clearly from my experience taking care of them, that of the 50% who died, they did not all die from the biology of the cancer.
Right.
Some of them died because they were unable, or their families were unable, to take the rigors and pain of the several years of treatment. So I thought, if there's
Yeah.
anything I could think of that might help equip our 3 year old son for what I knew lay ahead for him, I would do it. And I thought I'll develop a series of bedtime stories to toughen him up.
That's incredible. And I love that I don't want to rabbit trail on that point of that the 50% that die aren't necessarily dying from the pathology of the disease, right? They're dying from
Right.
other impacts, right, that come afterwards, or just like you said, the rigors of trying to get through treatment, and the emotional impact for sure. I think that has a huge impact on children. Now, what I love about, so I'm going to read the title of your book. It's Bedtime Stories That Will Terrify Children. So, how did you come up with that title? Because your book is not there's some elements of suspense and scary things. But the goal actually isn't to terrify children, right?
Very, very perceptive. That's true. The title is not what the book is. Well, the book can be read at several levels. At one level, you could read the book to young children as a book of scary stories. Depends on how you select pieces, which stories, how you
Mm,
read them, how you serialize them. But you're quite right. The book's deeper message is about the the transmission of our core values in Western societies to the children, including courage, the ability to act and speak and do in spite of fear. The book, but it's not just fear. There are other values. Each story, in its own way, is crafted to aim at one of these cardinal values, including generativity, tolerance, authenticity, and others. So the stories are all suspenseful because I believe young children like that, and indeed the world is like that anyway. But they're not all about fear, and and they're not all definitely scary. I just thought a provocative title might be fun, and I don't believe that the titles of books have to say what they're really about.
No, absolutely. No, I loved that you titled it that because I was like, when I first read it, I was like, that sounds terrifying and I must read it. Those were my two first thoughts. Because I'm like, there's no way if the goal is 8 stories to help parents and children navigate fear, right? Then there's no way that the end result can just be that we're constantly living in a place of terror. So I actually started reading your book on a walk because I wanted to do my research, before having you on. And there were parts where like my heart was racing a little bit. I think the first story in there, about the dog, I was like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And then the ending was so beautiful and so like you tapped into something in all of our nature that allows us to rise up in courage, right? And so I think the way that you write is really beautiful. It's captivating. I know that if I loved it, my children will love it as well. But I think that you also touched on something in what you just said, which is that we're all exposed to fear, right? Whether it's through literature or the real world. But children in particular learn by stories, right? They learn by these creative experiences that come through movies or audiobooks or literature. And then they can take those principles and apply them to maybe real life experiences that feel the same. That's that principle of generalization in learning, right? So I think you did a really good job of tapping into that emotional piece for people. Were there certain stories in your book that came not only from your personal experience raising your children, but also from your pediatric career? I'm just curious about that.
Well, first I'll just say how much I enjoy these kind words that you've said about the book, and I will kind of elaborate what you said and point out that we're hardwired to be fearful. Even infants, if a big dog barks at them or something, they have a paroxysm of fear and terror. So we're hardwired, and someone who doesn't have enough fear built into him or her is quite dysfunctional. But we don't want it to get carried too far. So it has to be modulated as they grow up. So, I would say that that happens in several ways. One is identification with the parents. They see how we talk about and share with them about difficult and whatever situations, or how we personally deal with it. They know who we are. And then I think
Yeah.
in the bedtime stories give them mythological figures that they can identify with. And in my book, the two boys, Randy and Brenton, they're in the stories too, so there's no question about the identifications. The individual stories, what was it you asked about the individual stories?
Oh, if they were informed by not only your parenting,
Oh,
but also your pediatric career.
I just made them up.
Love it.
What I think came from my time with small children and pediatrics was a sense of how to maybe relate to very sick children.
Mm,
They're not like adults. You can't read, give them a medical journal and have them, or a nursing journal, and have them read it, and that'll tell about this or that. You can't sit down and give them a didactic lecture on B cell DNA dysfunction and
right.
leukemia. It has to be indirect, modeling based, and young children, by the way, they like books that have scary covers. If you go by, in my experience, if you go by a bookstore where they have a children's section and a row of children's books, I'll bet you anything that most of those books now, the children's bookstores I go to, look pretty soft and swishy in just general. And I
Right.
think if the bedtime stories book were there with the pictures on it, I'll bet you the children would go for it. But the parents, some parents, I'm hearing, it's the parents, the grown-ups, who are afraid of it.
Absolutely. And I fully agree with you. Like I said, I was sucked into the vortex right by your title, without even like looking at the picture. I was like, ooh, I gotta check that out. That's amazing. But you're absolutely right that children are, I forget what the exact term is. I remember learning this, I think, in my first year in pediatrics, which was, it was the world, kind of like we have to tap into the world of imagination with them, especially in
Yes,
really complex, intense matters, because that's the only way that they can conceptualize what's happening to them.
yes,
And
yes.
I think you've done a really, I don't think, I know that you've done a really good job with this. So tell us a little bit about how the brain responds to fear and uncertainty, and how stories can help with emotional regulation.
With if you look at animal models of fear, anxiety, uncertainty, rodents and things like that, in the animal models of that, if the stimuli are prolonged and unmitigated, after a time the animal just gives up,
Yeah.
becomes helpless, hopeless. And we have human analogs of that. Some elements of post traumatic stress disorder are apathetic, ineffectiveness, emotional and physical paralysis. And in war, there are several sorts of combat related stress syndromes. And one of them, for those who have been in it for a prolonged period of time, they just won't do it anymore. And
Right.
so the trick is to develop. I think the goal in childhood is to develop a resilience with regard to fear, anxiety, uncertainty, doubt, self-doubt. Develop a resilience that will be functional throughout lifespan. And so I think in the bedtime stories, what comes across are mythological figures, heroic figures in each story in the bedtime stories book. Wait, I'll show a picture of it. There it is. In each
Love it.
story, there's a hero, not necessarily a human, and and there are evil characters and evil spirits, and the children with their wonderful imaginations. They are quite comfortable with that. They need no explanation about these things. That's how they see the world, and the ending for each story, as in the first, it can't be too bad. I mean, in the
Right.
story about the evil squirrel who presides over the ragged hole in space and time on an oak tree that eats children, a couple of children are indeed eaten. But children, they can deal with that too. The final ending has to have some heroism, some mitigation to it, though. So that's, I wanted to craft the stories that way, and I hope that I did.
Absolutely. And I love that you touched on the complexity of emotion and resilience, because I think that there is, at least when when I work with families a lot, there is this almost an underestimation in parents of how complex their child's emotions might be. Like, we think that they're not experiencing maybe a wide breadth and depth of emotional complexity, right? And I'm not even talking about like having a major diagnosis. I'm just talking about in their daily life, their interactions with siblings, their interactions with friends. Sometimes we minimize that. Just because they're little doesn't mean that they're having littler emotional experiences and less of a need for resilience. In fact, most of the research shows that we develop our almost our grid for resilience in early childhood. And then we carry that with us, right, all the way into adulthood. And so tapping into the way that a child's brain is wired through imagination and play and creativity, like you did through stories, can really help them to build that map, in my opinion, for resilience. And I think you've done a
Right,
really
and I
good job with that.
think I love those kind words. I think that the reason we don't share more with the children about these things when they're small is because we are afraid of it. And they pick that up. Whereas, as you say, they're actually very comfortable in talking about things if we explain it to them. And the grid, the notion of a set of resilience capacities, defenses, that has a neurologic basis because the children at age 2 or 3 have many more brain cells than
Right.
a 25-year-old, and a majority of the brain cells drop out through a process of modeling, making neural networks. If you use these, and then putting the networks in place, and that comes through use. And I think that hearing stories, telling stories, sharing stories with them so that it's shared, I can't help but believe that that has a lot to do with that process of developing the neural networks that will serve us well in later years.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm just, as you're talking, I was thinking about how we had the wonderful privilege in our hospital. And granted, it was a children's hospital, very well known children's hospital in our area. We had the privilege of having play therapists on every shift. Now, that didn't mean that we got to always access them for every patient, right? But I tried to utilize them as much as I could because they really knew how to tap into imagination, creativity, and play to process trauma, the trauma of the medical event, how the child is processing, their experience, and provide that additional support for families. And one of the things that they would often do, not, they wouldn't just initiate play with the child, but they would bring in books and stories that helped the child to relate to a character and see their own strengths, right, that are needed to overcome this thing. Like you said, the hero that we all want to identify with. We identify not just with the hero, but with the parts of us that are afraid too, right? And the characters that really struggle with fear because we also struggle with those things. And so storytelling, I think, is a great tool that we can use to help children process whatever it is that they're going through. So, how can families better understand, in your opinion, the relationship between brain health and the whole person's well being? Because I think, especially if you're raising a child with a complex medical diagnosis, like a lot of my listeners do, or, in our case, we had a child with autoimmune encephalitis that massively impacted her function. How can we help families better understand that relationship between their brain health and their whole person well-being?
Well, that's a hard question. I think the diseases are so different, and there's some of them are so terrible. There's an acute phase. I'm speaking more from my personal experience in the family, but I saw many children with other things, including physical trauma. There's an acute phase where the goal is just to survive and get through it so that you can develop the long process of adjusting your personal identity, which is still fragile in those early years, with this neuromedical disease or injury that's been there. And each child does that in his or her own way. It takes many years, and the task, I think, is never fully finished.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't know if you're open to sharing this, it may be too personal. But have you seen with your own child that there's been, I'm sure, ongoing processing of what that, initial diagnosis was like, or maybe he was too young to remember. I'm not really sure. But what has that been like for you as the parent to navigate that as he's gotten older?
Yeah, our child is now 39 years old, a successful financial executive on the East Coast. He's married. He has his
Wow.
own son who's now 18 months old. He's very, just a great person. And my wife and I would never bring this up, the leukemia, but from time to time he does, just as an offhand, so that we know that he's still thinking about it, living with it, moving
Yeah,
on, as if you will, like courage as to fear, having the courage to move on in spite of it. But we
absolutely.
don't. Well, no, we don't engage. We don't engage him about it, and we never bring the topic up now. But I know it's in there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure, it is that delicate balance. I feel like, my daughter's a teenager now, and it's that delicate balance of not wanting to project how traumatizing that experience was for us as the parents onto them, right? Because they're going to have their own complete own experience with that, and letting it be her initiation, but also finding striking the balance of letting her know that the door is always open for that conversation, right? Which I think you've done. It sounds like in your relationship with your son, which is wonderful. What would you say to parents who maybe are afraid to get into the emotional realm of, sometimes I think we, in wanting to avoid our own emotions about things, or like you said, being afraid of our own emotions, we try to overprotect our children and not let them experience some of the intensity or emotional dialogue that's really important in literature. What would you say to parents who are listening that maybe have a hard time discussing some of those things with their kids? How can your book help them?
Well, I hope my book can, but but the bedtime stories are the vehicle for that. It is difficult to talk with, especially young children, about these hard to discuss things, but to avoid it, to be afraid to bring those topics up, to be afraid to share with our children our own fears to some extent. That's worse because then they grow up more timid and anxious. Uh, the nice thing about stories, you can make them up your way so that they suit you and your children, and each family's different. You can make them up so they go just so far as you wish to go. And by the way, if you make a mistake and gonna go a bit too far on the scary side of a story, the children will tell you. They'll say, "No, I don't
Yeah.
want to hear that."
Yep.
Or sometimes
Absolutely.
the children will actually tell you what story they want from time to time.
Right.
I want a story about a bear and this or that. They'll do that sometimes.
Absolutely. And yeah, I know my youngest is very good about letting us know when she's met her threshold, but sometimes I will, when I know the ending of something, I will encourage her to push through. I'm like, it's not what you think. I promise. Let's just hang in there and see what comes after. And I think in your stories, like you said, there's always this something that you come out of the end with that is beneficial for them, that's developing an element of their character, or giving us a glimpse into something that maybe was never modeled for us, like courage in the face of fear, or what have you. I mean, there's so many different examples that you have in your book, which I think are lovely. So for for our listeners, I would love to just hear anything else that's on your mind today that you want to share with them. What words of encouragement would you give to those that are going to be listening to your episode today?
Wow, that's a wonderful invitation. Parenting, I think, is the most difficult thing that we do because it has to be totally carried out on the basis of what's good for the children, not as what is good or fun for us as the parents. And that's the most difficult thing about it. And we all fail to some extent here and there. But the greatest satisfaction of all is when you see a young person grow up well, and that makes up for all that went before.
Oh, that's such a good way to nutshell it. Absolutely. I am not there yet in my season of parenting. I have a teenager and a 10-year-old, but that is really what we hope for, is to get to that season where they're thriving and they're in adulthood, and all of the mistakes that we made because we were learning with them, right? We just hope that they become fruitful, right? Fruitful mistakes. I hope that you learned from my mistakes in parenting is kind of my motto, and staying in a place of humility with that too. So I loved this conversation, Randolph. I thought this was wonderful. I can't recommend your book enough. So I'm going to make sure that I put the link to that in the show notes and send that out to my email list as well. Do you have any final parting words today?
No, it's a pleasure to talk to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much. Well, I wish you the best in sharing your book with the world, and I look forward to sharing it with my audience. So thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome.